afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Food for Thought Visibility Matters LGBTQI plus Cultural Responsiveness Training Part 1. Part 2. You are correct. If you missed Part 1 2 weeks ago, I will go ahead and resend our YouTube link to everyone so that you have the opportunity to catch up on what you missed during Part 1. It was a wonderful presentation. Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you can please familiarize yourself with the buttons down at the bottom of the screen. You can ask questions through the chat or through the Q&A. You can raise your hand. I will be monitoring the chat, the raised hands, and making sure that everyone questions are being answered. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, that way people know your name, your contact information, where you're joining us from, and how to get a hold of you. I want to go ahead and thank Sarah once again for participating and being a part of our Food for Thought presentations. Sarah is currently the LGBTQ community liaison for PCOA, Pima Council on Aging. And they hold a BA in Gender and Women's Studies. They hold a BA in Gender and Women's Studies from the University of Arizona. Sarah has worked for Wingspan, Southern Arizona AIDS Foundation, Tucson Interfaith HIV/AIDS Network, and has been educating Southern Arizona on the LGBTQI plus community for 9 years. So we want to go ahead and welcome Sarah, and I am handing it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kenya. I appreciate the invite. Happy to be here. This is a hybrid presentation, so while I have some folks here on the Zoom platform, I also have some folks that I'll be talking to live in the room, so please forgive my divided attention. And I do want to give just a real brief overview. There are some folks that weren't able to be here last time, so I'm going to fly through what we covered last time. And truly, if you have any questions or things that you want to share, Kenya's here to help me with the chat box, the Q&A, raise your hand. I would hate to plow forward without folks that are on the same page. So please do engage with me. I love it. I love it. So this is Visibility Matters, LGBTQI plus and aging training. We are here. Last time we did most of the historical context that really informs some of the barriers and fears that the LGBTQ plus older adults experience when we're talking about accessing aging-related care. And there are a number of different components of our identities that have an impact on our experiences in the world that we need to take into account. LGBTQI plus is one of those facets of identity that makes an impact, but there are a multitude of those. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And then we'll talk today more about relevant supports and responsive care. So we're gonna skip past some videos that we watched last week. Please a presentation on YouTube because those videos are really worth it. So we talked a lot about some history that provides context in terms of why the LGBTQI plus older adult community maybe has some reservations, some barriers to accessing services. The history of discrimination was intense, and the incentive to remain closeted, to not be open and authentic with who they were and are, was really profound. And that's not something that you let go of, particularly in later life, right? It's not just that the world has changed and all of a sudden it feels better, right? You take that with you. We talked a lot about some of the Supreme Court decisions and pieces of legislation that have moved us forward to where we are today, why it feels so different to be LGBTQ in the world at the moment. But we still have a long way to go. And then we did some foundational work, right? So the heteronormative box says if you are born with XX chromosomes and a vagina and internal reproductive organs like ovaries in your body produces estrogen, you are expected to identify and behave as a woman and have feminine qualities and have romantic interests in the other side of the box. So this is the heteronormative box, right? We're all familiar with this paradigm, and it is beautiful and it works for so many people, but it doesn't work for everybody. And that's why I'm here today, right? Because there's so much more than just this paradigm. We talked about some LGBTQ basics, so the difference between sexual identity, gender, and gender expression. We all have these things. They're all normal. And they don't always align in the ways that we expect them to. They all exist on their own spectrum. And then we did just a little bit of the alphabet breakdown. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans. Some additional terms that you might hear. Two-spirit, intersex, and queer. And this is really where we left off last time. So I'm going to pause for just a second. If anybody has any questions with any of that content before I proceed to kind of the factors that create disparities and inequalities in this community. Kenya, do we have any chat box folks?
We don't have any questions right now in the chat, but I also want to remind everyone that they are able to unmute themselves. So if you have a question, go ahead and unmute yourself. Just please remember to mute yourself after your comment or your questions. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So what creates inequality? There are a number of things, and really the next few slides are going to be just vocabulary. I want to be able to give you all the language to start digesting and talking about some of this stuff. So heterosexism is just the assumption that everybody is heterosexual, right? That's why LGBTQ folks have to come out, because there is that assumption that unless you come out, you are straight and you are cisgendered. And if you don't come out, then that's kind of the default that we have, right? So that's heterosexism. Cisgender just means that your birth sex is in alignment with your gender, the way that you feel about yourself internally, or your internal sense of yourself. And then straight privilege. I would love to hear chat box folks, please engage with me, and real life folks in front of me. So straight privilege is just basic civil rights privileges that heterosexual people automatically get because of heterosexism, right? Because the assumption is that everybody's heterosexual. So what are some even little straight privileges, right? And I'll throw out an example that I like to share. If you are coupled in a straight pairing and you decide to go to the movie theater and see a rom-com, you are very likely to be able to find a rom-com with a couple that kind of looks like you, more or less, right? A straight couple. That's a straight privilege. If you are in a queer couple or lesbian or gay couple, you may not be able to just pop into the movie theater and find a couple that looks like you. Right? Like we were all waiting for Brokeback Mountain. And that took decades. So what are some other examples? Adoption.
What about marriage?
Marriage is definitely one. So yeah, marriage, I don't know that it's easier now.
I'm thinking more in the Catholic. I'm Catholic.
Yeah, so it depends. Marriage in terms of like federally sanctioned, that has been something that we can do as of 2015. So when we're talking about LGBTQ plus older adults, somebody that was born in 1940, maybe met their lifetime partner in 1965, we'll say, could not get married for what, 50 years of their lives? Lives. And that might not have been something that couple survived to see. So when you're thinking about the adults that you're working with, the older adults that you're working with, marriage may not have been something that was an accessible privilege to them at the time that they maybe would have wanted that. So Kenya, yes, thank you. It kind of depends on how you perceive marriage and what sort of traditions and rites you want to have involved in your marriage ceremony, in your marriage generally. If you are a gay Catholic, you might not be able to get married in the church. That's the Catholic Church has not necessarily welcomed queer couples, broadly speaking. Here and there are some Catholic churches that have, but I'm unaware of anybody that's been able to have a lesbian or gay wedding in a Catholic church. So yes, it kind of depends. That is a straight privilege to be able to not necessarily have to worry about that. Homophobia, transphobia is, I'm going to assume that we're all on board with that, just kind of an aversion or discrimination against LGBTQI plus people. So what holds up these structures of discrimination, right? It's bias, discrimination. So implicit bias or unconscious bias are attitudes or stereotypes that impact our understanding about groups of people that are maybe not biases that we're aware of, right? That's what implicit bias means. We're not necessarily aware of it. And they may impact our behaviors because they impact our attitudes and beliefs about people. They may also impact our behaviors and the way that we serve particular people. So it behooves us to try and be self-reflective and to think through why we have the understandings that we do, why we have come to the conclusions about some people that we have come to. Because they may not be rooted in something that's beneficial to the jobs that we're trying to do or the people that we're serving. Discrimination is kind of that bias taking form in behavior, right? It is unjust or prejudicial treatment against people based on a particular category or perspective that we have about them. And this can lead to unequal access to services, right? I assume that maybe Kenya can inform me what's happening in the chat box if you all have shared where you're from. I assume we're all kind of service providers and we're trying to accomplish kind of the best care that we can offer to the people that are accessing our institutions. So if we have some biases that we're unaware of, and that is equating to behavioral discrimination, that has a broader impact, especially for minority communities that talk about this stuff and have already had historical impact tensions with the institutions that we're representing. All right, intersectionality is something that I referenced at the top of the hour, right? This is the framework of understanding that says that there are a multitude of facets of our identity that have an impact on our experiences in the world. And we need to care about all of that stuff, right? Our race has an impact on our experience in the world as much as our sexual identity, as much as our gender identity, right? It is different in the world for a Black woman than it is for a white woman. It's different in the world for a gay white man than it is for a Black woman, right? All of these things, or older adults, right? Ability has an impact. All of these facets of our identity need to be taken into consideration in order for us to best serve the person in front of us. Minority stress, another great vocab word that I would like you all to know, and that is being in a minority community means that you are aware of stigma and discrimination that equates to stress, right? It can have negative physical and mental health outcomes. I tend to think of hate crimes when I think of minority stress, right? Because hate crimes really play on minority stress, and they are never about that single person. It is always a message to a community, right? That says you and your kind are not okay in some way. And that's really minority stress, knowing that that discrimination could be present for you in your life because you hold this particular identity. But note that it's not inherent to your identity. It's not because you're lesbian, gay, bisexual. It's a result of the stigma and discrimination that is in the world, right? So it's external pressure that creates an internal negative health outcome. Does that make sense? Everybody all on the same page? All right.
No
all
questions.
Right. No questions. Okay. I know it's upsetting stuff. Okay, we're gonna move on to some statistics though. Everybody loves statistics. I'm just gonna say that bold-faced lie right out loud. LGBTQ, what? Oh, what? All right, so some people really do.
They're helpful.
That's great. They are helpful, right? So especially when we're trying to digest some of the interactions that are happening between this community and our institutions, right? This statistical data is really helpful because let's talk about the first couple, 2 or 3, right? So if LGBTQI plus people are twice as likely to live alone and 4 times less likely to have children, how does that impact our aging system? Like as they're trying to access our aging system, how does that have an impact? Well, our aging system really relies on informal supports in that way, right? Your spouse, your children are supposed to be helping out, take care of you. And if you are not a person that has a spouse, a partner, if you live alone and you don't have children that can help supplement some of that care, well, you're already kind of cut off at the knees when you're looking at aging related care and formalized services. So let's talk about the next one. 20% avoid seeking medical care for fear of discrimination. That's a huge number. That's a huge number. And I would say that I think that we have more statistics later, but there are a number of, I want to say half of LGBT folks have experienced discrimination directly from their medical providers, and trans people, it's even more. Aging care is not a one and done situation. So if you have 20% of folks that are avoiding medical care altogether, that's going to have a huge lifelong impact on their health.
Hannah says that she had never thought of that before. Great point.
Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. What else? What other statistics are you all noticing that you want to talk about? I'm going to move on if there are not any that you want to digest a little more. Don't worry, I have more statistics on the next slide.
Well, that last one's horrible.
Health risks of prolonged isolation have been equated with smoking 15 cigarettes daily. Yeah, so, and COVID, right? Social isolation, as it turns out, is like a really huge problem right now. Yeah. I'm a former smoker. I certainly feel the health impacts on that. That's not a good situation, for sure. All right, let's talk about some more statistics, but we're going to talk about QT BIPOC statistics. So queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. We're going to take an intersectional approach to this, right? So the statistics that we just saw, we got from SAGE USA, which is a really amazing organization that is a nationally renowned LGBTQ older adult serving organization. They're based out of New York, but they do a lot of work nationally to serve this community. However, a lot of times their data skews in a white direction. So I want to start taking a look at some statistical data that takes into account more than one facet of identity. So we're going to look at a 2015 survey. This was the United States Transgender Survey, completed in 2015. There were about 27,000 respondents overall for this survey. And what they've done with this data is extract, there's actually a number of these additional booklets, but right now I have pulled out some that are talking about the African American or Black community. And those folks, I want to say there were like 700 or 800, let me see. Yes, about 800 respondents identified in this survey as Black or African American. So that's what this data is helping us digest. When you take a look at the chart on the left, the housing situations that occurred in the past year, what we're looking at is the housing situation category, and then the percentage of Black folks in the United States Trans Survey versus the number of people in the survey overall. And we start to see that when we incorporate additional facets of identity, we see additional disparities, right? So the diagram on the right, the chart on the right, housing discrimination or instability in the past year due to being transgender is broken down by kind of both race and gender. So Black respondents overall is the one that's 40%, and then we have it by gender, right? So non-binary people, a little bit more, trans women, a little bit more, trans men, not quite as high. I mean, I don't want to say it's not that bad. That's not at all what I'm saying. Not as much, right? Trans women, Black trans women, half of them have had experienced housing discrimination in the past year. So this is 2015. 2015. We're still experiencing some pretty severe discriminatory practices between our institutions and the LGBTQ community.
So I have a question. I don't remember, I haven't filled out an apartment, contract in a really long time.
Sure.
Do people ask for your gender? Is this how it starts off? Or once they meet someone, they're saying, no, because you're transgender, we don't want you in our community? Is that the mentality? Is that how it works?
Sometimes, yes. So you're talking about SOGI data, right? So sexual orientation, so G, gender identity. I think that it's been a while for me filling out those applications too. As far as I know, there aren't property managers, and I don't know if it's legal to collect sexual orientation data. You can ask about sex, I think, birth sex. The issue when we're talking about trans discrimination is that frequently for trans folks, especially trans women, for a number of reasons, it is not something that you can hide. So for lesbian, gay, bisexual folks, you don't necessarily, it's not always obvious unless it's kind of embedded in your gender expression and people make their own assumptions. It's not always obvious who you're sleeping with. And so property managers don't necessarily know until there's a relationship visible in that home. For trans people, oftentimes, their transness is very visible on their bodies. And discrimination is absolutely something that happens overtly for many of them. The idea that we kind of embrace communities is not a widely shared perspective, and discrimination is still something that absolutely happens. As of last year, it's not legal. That is something that we talked about a little bit last time. Last year in June, the Supreme Court decision modified our Civil Rights Act of 1964 to include LGBTQI plus folks in that act, saying that, basically, I think it's employment discrimination is illegal. I think that housing discrimination, we still have a little bit to go, but it's also really hard to enforce. All right, so next up, we just have a few more graphs that really illustrate the same thing, right? So unemployment, living in poverty, this is all, when we take into consideration these additional facets of identity, right? For this one, we're looking at race and gender. We just get a little bit of a different story. And we start to see some additional disparities for some communities, right? So if you're working with a trans woman, you may have some additional, especially a trans woman that is also a person of color, you may have some additional work to support them around housing issues. whereas a trans man might not have the same issues, right? So when we're looking at the statistical data, it kind of informs where the support needs to happen.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for helping residents with trans caregivers? I had a member of staff who was a trans female, and when the residents realized, they had a lot of feelings and thoughts about it and were sometimes not very kind to me.
Yeah, that's a tough one. That is really a tough one. I do these trainings for residents as well, because really residents of our communities, of our assisted living communities, older adult communities, have lived through the same things that our LGBTQ folks have lived through, right? Like they also lived through the lavender scare. They also were informed by news organizations saying, you know, really derogatory things about LGBTQ people in the media. And so those folks could also use this training, and it is available to residents. I am happy to come and also provide some perspective to those folks that have a hard time understanding these identities. So that would be my first plug, I guess, is offer some training and support to those residents. But also, I would really evaluate your non-discrimination policies and how you uphold those, and what are the expectations that you have for the people that are accessing your services, and what support you provide to the people that are doing the work. What are your non-discrimination policies? Is that helpful?
Jennifer, do you have any other questions? She says thank you.
Yeah.
I have shared your contact information in the chat box as well too, so people can get a hold of you.
Yes, please do. Please do. I would be happy to continue that conversation too. It's tricky. It's tricky. All right. So again, as service providers, it's up to us to extend all available opportunities to the people that we're working with. And since there is no singular LGBTQ experience, it is important that we take into account the historic experiences, the historic context that they've lived through, their cultural backgrounds, all of the facets of their identities that will have an impact on the way that they are navigating our systems. And being informed of a number of those potential experiences is going to help determine what questions you need to ask and what support you need to offer. And also, I want you to know that having minority experiences doesn't mean that we need to come to these communities with pity or see them as, with any shame. For myself, I find that the identities that I hold have given me great power, right? My gender expression, my sexual orientation, my CRIP status. This has given me a platform to reach a whole lot of people and impact a whole lot of lives. And so I don't see myself with pity or shame. I think that I have it pretty good in many ways. I have also lied to the medical professionals before me so that I could sneak in a partner that I was afraid wouldn't be able to come in to visit me if I was open and upfront about the nature of my relationships. So it doesn't help us if we meet the people that we are working with pity. If that's how I was treated by a provider, I'm not coming back. And aging care is not a one and done situation. We need to be able to create relationships that can withstand the oopses and that will be able to continue accessing our folks, right? Behind every one of these statistics is a person that could use our support. And that's likely going to need ongoing support. As we age, we only become more vulnerable. I don't know anybody that gets stronger and more virulent as they get older, right? Our bodies tend to break down. We become more vulnerable, and we need to have care more as we age, generally. Ooh, all right, video time.
End of life, I mean, when we think about palliative and hospice care, what do we think about? I mean, who do you want with you? You want who you love. You want your friends. You also maybe don't want some people. So especially in hospice, palliative care, but I'm going to also say hospital care. But for some queer older adults, it's very scary because why would I tell you? Because, hey, last time I told someone he couldn't get in. He couldn't get in to see me. So if he just comes in as a friend, he can get in. But if I tell you he's my husband, it's not going to work. Because in the queer community, it's still, I'm sorry to say, I can think of something in the last few months where someone just assumed, hey, this is my life partner. They never wrote anything down. And out of nowhere came a biological brother in one case to make all the medical decisions. It's amazing to me that when family of origin folks have been out of contact for decades, and then suddenly they rise up and they have the rights at that point. So especially into life care of all kinds, to make sure paperwork's in order. And it's never too late for that, right? That's the thing.
Yes, in terms of plans or goals, I do think that like the majority of people, my plan is to stay in my home. And I want desperately to stay in my home and be independent and to have a good quality of life. And should I be incapacitated and need to be in assisted living or independent, I think it would arouse a lot of the same fears that I've expressed, that you fear that you would be discriminated against or that you wouldn't be valued if people knew that you were gay. And so it becomes extremely important to know that you have allies and that caregivers are accepting and value you for who you are.
What'd you all think of that video? What strikes you?
I just think overall, sometimes we live in a bubble, me, because I don't think about a lot of these things
Mm-hmm.
and what other people have to go through.
Sure. If you work for an aging facility in which you have residents, heads up. That's maybe the number one concern of LGBTQI plus older adults is housing situation, is in-home caregivers, really even. Being vulnerable in front of a person that has power over you in that way is so scary that many of them will not access care. Will not. Yeah. All right, let's talk about advanced care planning. So this is something that is really critical to this community because we are so much more vulnerable if we don't have this stuff taken care of, right? I've actually seen some research that says we may have advanced care planning taken care of a little bit more often than our straight cis counterparts. But if we don't have this in place, we are more vulnerable. And this is something I wish I knew when I was a case manager in my other life. Because for me, at the time, it kind of just came up as a box on the checklist of the paperwork that I was doing. But had I known that my clients that didn't have this done were so much more vulnerable, I might have reframed that question. I might have offered some support in different ways. That's a conversation that would have happened a lot differently had I known at the time. So let's talk about, in general, half of us become unable to make our own medical decisions as we age. That's just kind of overall, half of all of us become unable to make our own decisions. And the default in the medical profession is to treat aggressively, right? We're going to assume that you want to live and you want all of the things. We're going to intubate you. We're going to, do all of these really intense measures. whether or not this is something that you want. If you haven't written it down, that's the default. So if there's nothing to say otherwise, that if there are no documents present, a surrogate will be appointed to look for somebody to speak for you, to speak on your behalf. So this legal next of kin list is how it goes, right? And this is a heteronormative structure, right? We're going to look for a spouse, an adult child, first, an adult child second, parent, domestic partner, sibling, close friend. So think about the context that I've given you. Think about the data that I've given you. How does this work or not work for LGBTQ older adults? A couple slides ago, we saw they were twice as likely to live alone, 4 times less likely to have children. That's the top 2 on this list. So if you don't have a spouse, you don't have children, then we're going to default to parent. Okay, well, when we're talking about kind of natural aging, very often we don't have parents alive to help us make those decisions. Sometimes we do. A lot of times we don't. So D is domestic partner, right? We're all the way down on the 4th part of the list. So domestic partner. Okay. So maybe the 4th on the list could be a partner if we have one, but like we talked about before, twice as likely to live alone. LGBTQ folks are more likely to be solo seniors and not have these things. So siblings, okay, maybe we have a sibling. Sometimes LGBTQ folks do not have relationships with their families of origin. And so a sibling may or may not be an option. Close friend, last on the list. Yeah, LGBTQ folks have a beautiful history of taking care of each other. And it's possible that there's a close friend that is healthy enough to help out and show up as medical advocates for us in those vulnerable times when we can't speak for ourselves. But often our LGBTQ friends are aging with us and not able to help out in those ways. So a little bit more vulnerable, right? And Dr. Linda Travis had also mentioned, families of origin kind of coming out of the woodwork at the 11th hour to make decisions. And I want you to think about what that might look like for this community, right? Are there decisions that might be made by a family of origin that wouldn't be something that that person would want? This happens sometimes, especially in the trans community. We might find dead names, wrong pronouns on tombstone, on grave markers, on celebration of life materials. If I've worked my whole life to be Jane Doe and I pass away and my family decides that I'm going to be in memoriam from now until forever as John Doe, that's a crime. I mean, it's not a crime, but it should be a crime.
Probably even if they're buried, how they prepare the body to what you end up wearing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that can go for any person in the LGBTQ community. For many of us, gender expression, whether we're trans or not, gender expression is important to us. And if my parents wanted to put me in a dress that's not how I want to be. That's not who I am. So yes,
Hi, everybody. We had some technical difficulties with our internet. Sarah is in a loading mode, so we will be right back. Thank you so much for your patience. In the meantime, just a reminder that if you do have any questions for Sarah or you want to have your staff receive any education, she can do it all through webinars as well too. So there's a lot of flexibility, and I have placed her contact information in the chat box. If you don't have it or you logged on later, you can just shoot me an email, and then I can also share her contact information with everyone. Something else that I want to remind people about is that we have the 5 wishes books or pamphlets available as well. If you want me to drop off some for your residents or for your staff or everyone, just let me know how many you are looking for and I would gladly drop those off. I have also been doing presentations in the community where we talk about the pamphlet. We go over each page. It's very simple. It does not take very long, very informative. So just another way for us to provide education out in the community. And we also have our food for thought coming up next week. I'm sorry, next month, which will be talking about suicide prevention. So this is a topic that typically people don't like to openly discuss. Sometimes we see that someone has committed suicide and it's deemed as an accident, or things are being just not shared openly. And so we want to make sure that people are informed, that people have resources in case there is anything going on, so that people know that they are not alone. And we learn more and more with COVID that isolation, of course, has been very hard. A lot of people are facing anxiety. So once again, just any kind of questions that you might have, we're also a resource. I'm going to mute myself for just a second, and I'm going to see about getting the presentation back up. Yes?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm here. I'm so sorry, everyone.
Try sharing.
Okay, all right. It looks like I am sharing my screen.
No.
I am
Not
not
yet.
sharing my screen. That's not good. Okay, let's try one more time. It's gonna happen. I'm so sorry, everyone. Technology.
There. You're good to
Yeah,
go.
hey, great. Okay. So sorry about that. All right, I'm going to come back to wherever it was that all right, we're gonna fly through the last of this. 13 minutes to go, and I want to leave at least a couple minutes for questions. Okay, so barriers to care have a lot to do with fear, right? The historical discrimination that they have experienced, it means that there's some deep-rooted fear of discriminatory treatment from providers, not being able to have the people that they want to have with them at critical and vulnerable times. Sometimes not being able to have the religious or spiritual traditions and rites available at the end of their lives could also be a barrier to care. A lot of aging institutions are rooted in religious and spiritual beliefs. And like Kenya brought up earlier, if you are a practicing gay Catholic, the person wants for themselves. Assumptions about familial structures can impact the experiences of the families that are, experiencing grief and loss. Partners can feel isolated from grief support, largely because they may have to come out. There are some local LGBTQ grief support groups I don't know of any LGBTQ specific caregiver support groups. But, you know, if you have to come out and that doesn't feel like a safe thing to do, then you may not access that support for yourself, or you may find yourself playing the pronoun game. And, you know, I lost my husband when it really wasn't my husband, and that can really impact the efficacy of the support. Okay, we're skip on past here. So some resources for advanced care planning to support this community. I would absolutely recommend Southern Arizona Senior Pride. They do a great job with their Honoring a Life workshops, and they do offer individual coaching as well as PCOA. And we're great with serving LGBTQI plus people as well. This is Southern Arizona Senior Pride does that specifically. So, you know, for anybody that you're working with, please feel free to send them to either one of these organizations. Like I mentioned before, the fears of accessing this care, they're not unfounded, right? They are rooted in historic discrimination. You know, more than half of LGBT people reported discrimination directly from their healthcare professionals, and 70% of trans and gender nonconforming reported the same. This was from 2014. That's staggering data. Even if you're not a person that has directly experienced that discrimination, we know each other, right? We are aware of this historic trauma. And we know that it might be something that we experience eventually for ourselves. It can be difficult to access these things when you feel like you might have to come out. But it's really important that we do feel safe to come out, right? Because like we mentioned before, and unless LGBTQ folks feel like they can be their authentic selves, we're not going to know to activate that toolbox, right? We're not going to know that we are looking at a person that might be more vulnerable if they don't have their advanced care plan in order, right? And if we don't know that, we're maybe not going to have that conversation in the same way that we would if we knew. So we need to be visible in our efforts. We need to have rainbow flags and pink triangles in shared spaces, right? So if you have a welcome center, right, reception, throw up some sort of safe space symbol so that folks know that this may be a place where they're safe to come out. Use inclusive language on your forms. Do not only ask for male and female gender. If you can't list a number of options, leave it blank and ask people to self-identify. Just what is your gender? And let people fill it in for themselves. Don't assume and this is really important for everybody in your organization to get trained, right? Because oftentimes the people that are taking these trainings are case managers, are direct care workers, but the person that answers the phone may make the assumption that when that phone is answered, when they hear a deep voice on the other end of the line, that's a man. We can't make those assumptions. And that receptionist is harming your organization's ability to best serve this community. So make sure everybody at your organization has these trainings so that we all know you cannot make those assumptions. If you hear a deep voice on the other end of the line, doesn't mean you're speaking to a man. How can I help you today? Remove sir, ma'am from your language. Respect the names and pronouns that are given to you. And don't out anyone. We don't necessarily know if there are safety concerns, if there are family members that there are contentious relationships with. Don't out anyone. If you need to talk to somebody about somebody's sexual identity or gender orientation, make sure you're in a private space. Clear it with that person before you do that. And, if you need to talk to a supervisor to, debrief something, that makes sense. Let that person know. Make sure it's in a private space and nobody else outside that knows. If you make a mistake, apologize once and move on. This happens. it's framed in this way, right? Because frequently when people mess up pronouns, it's kind of a big embarrassing mistake and people tend to over apologize. But that's really more about your own embarrassment, and it can call attention, unnecessary attention to that person. And really we just, I'm so sorry, correct yourself and then move on. Don't call unnecessary attention to the situation. Open-ended questions. Who cares about you? Who's going to be visiting you? Who's going to take care of you? Those are all great ways to ask about the sort of supports that a person might have without saying, is your wife going to be coming to visit? Take out gender language everywhere that you can until and unless somebody discloses what their gender and pronouns are, until they disclose who their partner is. Remove gendered language as much as LGBTQI plus specific programming, right? If you have grief support groups at your organization, create one that is specific to LGBTQI plus people, and don't give up. If you don't get, queer people for the first couple times, it's hard to come out. It doesn't mean that you don't have anybody that wants that. It means that it's hard to come out, and it might take a little bit to work up to it. If you have game days, activity days, or whatever, throw in LGBTQI specific movies, right? Like The Birdcage was a super fun film. Everybody loves that. Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. I mean, it doesn't take much to include queer programming. And then, like I said before, regular training for all staff. I have these trainings available through the PCOA website. You can look at Visibility Matters and see the next 3 months of scheduling for these basic trainings. You would register through Eventbrite. It's 2 hours, regular training for all staff. Visibility really does matter. Unless LGBTQI plus older adults feel that they can share who they are, we're not going to know about their potential unique needs. We're not going to know to activate that toolbox that we all now have. And it's really difficult for many people in this community to come out because of the discrimination and the historic trauma that they've experienced. So be visible in your efforts to reach this community. We need to be creating relationships that can withstand the oopses, and forgive yourself for oopses when they happen. And just make sure that the folks that you are working with know that they are cared about and that they are safe. Here are some local resources. I would highly recommend Southern Arizona Senior Pride for any LGBTQI plus clients, members, patients that you have. Southern Arizona Gender Alliance is also a phenomenal organization that offers their own specific trainings for trans identities. So was it Rachel, Jennifer? I don't remember. Jennifer, you asked about training. I would certainly reach out to Southern Arizona Gender Alliance to see if they have best practices available, but they do offer trainings. And then again, Pima Council on Aging, I'm available as a resource to you all for technical support. Please feel free to reach out to me for anything that you need. What else do I want to share? I think we have time for questions, comments. Oh, we have 1 minute. I'll hang out. Anybody else that wants to hang out too. I've got a few minutes, so ask me stuff. Thank you so much for being. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to come in, for doing it in person as well as a webinar. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please send me an email. If you have more than one person at your facility who has watched this training and you would like a certificate of attendance, please send me their first name and last name so I may email you those certificates out. I will upload this recording to our YouTube channel again, and that way you can also share this with your staff. Darlene says, thanks for an excellent class. I learned a lot. Blessings. Thank you. This was great.
My pleasure.
Hannah says, thanks for doing this work and for a great training.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you,
Okay.
everybody. Have a great
Appreciate it.
afternoon. Bye-bye.